Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I sit down with the people who create the video games you know and love. On today's episode, I sat down with one of the game devs behind the video game I Expect You to Die 3, Cog In The Machine. I Expect You to Die 3, Cog In The Machine is the newest game in the I Expect You to Die series of video games. In this game, you play as a secret agent, Agent Phoenix, who goes through a series of missions filled with puzzles and a really awesome story. Before we get into the interview, I do want to give a spoiler warning because we talk about the game in its entirety, its story, and the ending. So, without any further ado, let's get into the interview.
I am Chance. I was the level lead for 1, 3, and 5, which is House Call, Blind Spot, Cold Shoulder. Pretty sure that's right. And I was also the game design lead for a lot of the interactions and best practices and nitty-gritty stuff for content authoring.
So what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
Oh, geez, good question. Playing games as a kid. It's probably it. I have plenty of favorite inspirations, like Super Mario Sunshine was just the one I always played since that was the one I grew up with. Pokemon, all that, yada, yada. I think the real thing that I did was I went to school for computer science just because that was a good general degree. I like being more of a jack of all trades. For 4 years, didn't want to code for the rest of my life. Figured, hey, let's try to get into games because that's pretty applicable to do that with computer science. And I've just been here ever since, getting to do a different thing every day. It's what I'm attracted to the most.
Awesome. So at what point after releasing the second game did you all over at Shell Games decide you wanted to go and make the third game? And what did these sort of early brainstorming processes look like for levels and story pieces?
Yeah, good question. So I was on I Expect You to Die 2 until the end of beta, which was start of 2021, I think. It came out mid-2021. So I left while the team did all the porting, yada, yada, yada. Game eventually came out. And then immediately after the release of 2, we started this fun little prototyping project where we just kind of did whatever we wanted to do in the franchise. We experimented with things like, do we want the player to walk around? What if you're on a zip line? Kinds of puzzles we've always wanted to do, mechanics we've always wanted to do, set pieces we've always wanted to do. And it was totally free reign for about a month or 2. 4 designers and an engineer and the design director from 2, just doing whatever we wanted. That laid the ground for a ton of ideas that we could then repurpose into proper pitches for a third game. That prototyping team kind of led right into the development of the third game, and also Among Us VR. It was 50-50. I think they started around the same time. So that prototyping section started, and we kind of went into formalizing this. Okay, we've all got motion sick on the zipline level. What if it's a cable car instead? And kind of paring down the ideas into smaller chunks of level proposals. Where we're okay, we know we want 6 levels. We know we want to stick with roughly the same schedule as an I Expect You to Die 2. Let's see how we can fit all of our cool prototypes into neat little boxes that fit into a nice timeline together.
So obviously the game is inspired by classic spy films such as James Bond, but what were some other places where you all on the design team pulled inspiration for different elements of the game?
Spy films are almost always what we did. A big thing of this game was to be more of an action spy as opposed to the MacGyver old Bond spy, right? So we have the car chase, we have the cable car collapse, we have those more actiony, intense set pieces. That is where the majority of the inspiration comes, I would think. A lot of it is in adventure tourism, too, which is kind of a subset of the spy fantasy, but being in exotic locales with depth of interaction that you would not normally be in. We're in a ski resort in Hokkaido. Okay, you got a lot of the cool spy things there, too, but also lets us do things like fun Japanese souvenir cookies or a fun hat that a spy would never wear, but the agent would totally wear. And yeah, usually real-world inspiration and spy inspiration are the 2 prongs of every level.
I love how some of the levels took us back to locations similar to places we've been before in previous games, but put a new twist on them. Can you tell me a bit about how you all on the design team took these classic locations and gave them a new twist while still keeping some familiar elements of previous levels we've been at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This happened a little bit unintentionally on the project. So this is the third game in the series. We had much of the same staff as the first game. So a bunch of passionate people still championing ideas all the way back from 2016 are on the project. So they were able to say, hey, remember that volcano from 2016? What if we actually did it now? We didn't really have a cognizant, let's kind of make everything I Expect You to Die the franchise has always wanted to make, but it definitely became that, especially as we started the like first alpha of this project. Like we realized then, oh, this is a car level. We can pay off everything that we didn't pay off from the first car level. We can take an Easter egg of there being a giant squid mention to then actually making a giant squid in the third game. Our development pipeline has gotten really lean and mean now that we're in the third title of the game, so we can do larger scope, more payoff interactions like those. So to answer the question, unintentional, but super glad that we got it.
One of those levels was the level Hot Water, and on the topic of that level, throughout papers and references in that level and many other levels, there are references to other characters throughout the franchise. Can you tell me a bit about bringing these characters back in writing and other forms to sort of add to the lore of the universe and world building, but not like go back to story points that we've already touched on in other games?
Hot Water has, Hive Mind and the Fabricator as both characters there. Great cameos, I think. So to start with this process, our narrative designer, Jared Mason, narrative director, worked on compiling a story Bible for all of the I Expect You to Die lore around the start of I Expect You to Die 3's production. So we knew we had that strong backlog of like literally every single thing mentioned in previous games, including companies to character names to everything. Like that's another thing. Like we go as minute of a detail as possible to the extent of I think like the papers from the Home of Tomorrow level, the house call level, are like the same company name as like some throwaway company from the first game. We strive for that consistency. So the team is very on board with bringing back characters like that. It's always very challenging because we want to not compete with the vision for the levels and their own intent to not like, shove in these old characters, right? A lot of it is like scheduling challenges, like, oh, is this voice actor even available? Are they just going to be like a text reference, yada, yada, yada. So really it is, we do the best with what we can fit in a schedule. So it ended up with being, okay, Hive Mind, you're just going to be a text cameo, but we could get the Fabricator's voice actor. So we got her voice in that level and very much putting in enough to feel like there's continuance, but without stepping on the level's toes was the line we kind of towed. But it is very intentional to bring things like this back.
So you mentioned a lore Bible of the game and story and everything. Tell me a bit about what that looks like and how often you reference it and different ways you all use it when making the game.
So Jared owns it. I'm pretty sure it's just a giant Google Doc of every single thing mentioned in any game ever, organized by level. So it's just a huge information dump. Usually Jared is able to consult on like hero art assets, or someone on the team is just familiar with the background of this thing. Like, oh, we've used a soda brand before, or, hey, I remember that Zor bars, Zor ice cream pops have a bunch of lead in them. So we're able to like remember on the team because there's enough institutional knowledge to be able to bring these jokes back. But the process of actually using the story Bible doc is we're able to search like, hey, octopus, hey, book, and say, oh, okay, I executed level 1 book was titled this. And then we're able to say, can we make a joke out of this? Can we make a meaningful reference out of that? And it's very much used like a database or a wiki almost. And we did consult the fan wiki for at least a couple of things to make sure we were right.
Pretty much every game has strange or interesting ideas that were considered at one point, and you talked about working through these in the prototype phase. What were some of these strange and interesting ideas, whether it's puzzles, levels, deaths, etc.?
Geez, I could talk about that forever. I'll limit myself to like 3, I think. Zipline is something we really wanted to do. The first cable car prototype had you start at like the base of the cable car, and the cable car itself or gondola itself was way out there. To hook up your rappel thing, then go diagonally towards the cable car, breaking through the glass, and then landing in the car, and having to do the level that way. That was a wonderful prototype that we skewed away from because we thought it was a bit too intense. So we settled on rappelling straight down at the end of Cold Shoulder instead. But I hope we bring that back at some point. The second of the 3 I'm going to talk about is the car prototypes for the blind spot level. There were a ton of prototypes for this because we weren't sure if we wanted to commit to like full car movement and car motion. And that motion comfort discourse was a huge part of figuring out what was right for that level. But the early prototypes just had you in a car in various precarious situations. And one was in a lumber mill where the limo is stuck in a tree. You got to get the limo out of the tree. And there was a bunch of fun things like a log and a giant saw blade that cuts the car in half at different points, and a lot of fun, the lumber-related traps that we've never done before. And the last one, I think, the teams on I Expect You to Die franchises games they really like in-jokes, and in-jokes almost always find their way into the levels. And there was this joke about a telekinetic rat in the blind spot level. and the team got really hooked on this idea of like, what if there was a little agent buddy rat that could be your companion in levels? And we never did anything with that, but almost every meeting about that level had an agent rat mentioned, and it was great. So hopefully we do an animal companion level at some point.
I would love to see that level. You talked about adding more movement in this game than I think we've seen in previous games. Can you tell me a bit about the decision to add in more movement throughout the levels in comparison to the previous two games?
Yeah, good question. A lot of it is, as I mentioned, kind of trying to fulfill that action spy fantasy and get set pieces from spy tropes that we've never done before. So the car chase, the cable car, blah blah blah, all of that. It was basically as simple as that, and trying to get prototypes that fulfilled this, and trying to get the stakeholders of like our executive team and the directors on board with this idea that we would not betray the core, seated, comfortable expectations that the franchise has worked very hard to establish, especially because we were one of the first mainstream VR titles in 2016 to be very focused about this is a seated, comfortable experience that you don't have to twist or turn too much to do. So it's just a lot of trial and error. This is kind of a first for the studio too. We definitely have movement that is intense and until you fall, but figuring out the pipeline for like how much motion are we comfortable with, what do we need to play test to make it seem okay for everyone, was kind of blazing a little bit of new ground.
Another change from previous games that sort of shifts in this game is there's a lot more combat, and you mentioned the action adventure. Can you tell me a bit about creating the combat for this game while still staying true to the previous games?
As part of the initial prototyping phase, we prototyped boss battles. Nothing really great came out of those. There was like one in a planetarium against, I think, the Fabricator that was like okay enough. But we knew we wanted more character interaction and more like puzzly character interaction than Executive 2, where you don't really interact with John Juniper all that much. So we were wondering if we could push on that a little bit more. The first level, House Call, we knew we had a robot as like a primary thing you're going to interact with. And that was where all the robot ideas kind of started. None of the other levels were designed to have robots in them from the start. So they eventually found their way into all the other levels as they became core to our game's emotional arc and story. I don't think we yet found true answer for like what is an IX-Executive boss battle or an IX-Executive combat encounter, because it's kind of just different variations on the same robot battle in its current form. We looked a lot at Zelda boss battles and more puzzle-focused boss battles as inspiration, but I don't think we have anything solid yet. I would really hope the next game, whenever that may be, explores this a bit more.
When creating puzzles for games, it's important to find the balance between making the puzzle not so difficult the player gets frustrated and gives up, but not so easy that the player still has that moment where they're excited that they finished and figured it out. How did you all work to achieve that balance with the puzzles in I Expected It I3?
Playtesting every single week without fail for 2 years. And if you don't playtest 1 week, you better have a good excuse or a good reason to not do so. That's really the secret sauce. We have a couple other, playtesting specific questions that we ask, like, when were you frustrated? What do you want to do? All those kind of things, but really just playtesting weekly and playtesting with a wide variety of playtesters. Usually it's very satisfying when we release the game and you see about the same number of reviews saying these puzzles are too hard and these puzzles are too easy. And then hang that right in the middle is how we know we did good.
What was your process for playtesting the game? And was there any really important information that you learned through playtesting, like all the players aren't understanding this bit of the story or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. That happened every single week, whether as small as players don't recognize this lever as a lever, so we got to go change the art or some presentation of it, to as big as players aren't understanding the story beat. Stuff like that happens every single week in game development. We were lucky to have a playtest coordinator as like a dedicated role on Quantum for the first time. Quantum being I Expected I3. I Expected I2 did have some playtest coordinator roles that kind of were emerging, but we really formalized it in I Expected I3. What this means is that a designer like me knows what we want to playtest. Like, hey, let's check the puzzles in the first part of level 5. So we can say, hey, Fiona, our playtest coordinator, can you get us 2 playtesters who have never played this level before? I'm free at like 1 p.m. And then all the design team has to do is show up at the playtest. We can run the playtest the world if you want to run it, and then just get all of our data in. So really decoupling this process of like sourcing playtesters, onboarding them, making sure their quest runs, making sure their mics and webcams run, yada, 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 being someone else than a designer was a huge blessing and let us have a bunch of free time to do all the other designer stuff that we needed to do. It was also helpful in parsing large amounts of data, especially motion comfort, because Fiona was great at, giving us X amount of players were sick at this part, Y amount of people complained about the headlights on the truck, stuff like that. The process is just getting a ton of people at set times, and usually naive playtesters, naive meaning people who've never played the game before. That was pretty useful to us.
So in each game, Agent Phoenix has a different lobby, and each one has a different look that gives the feel for the game. How did you all eventually land on the current lobby you have? And were there any alternate lobby options you were all thinking about before you landed on the one that's currently in the game?
Good question. So for 2, we were like always certain it was going to be a van. And we are like, yeah, a van is right. A van is spy. It's funny. And it works. For 3, we did all the levels kits first for like levels 1 through 6. And we were like, okay, we're pretty confident that these are our levels. And we ran out of pre-production time. And we had to start saying, we'll put the tutorial and the hub and the title screen was originally meant to be in the same space as well. But I think it made its way to its own scene, which is also the win room where you go after you win all the levels. So it was kind of for this game, an afterthought decision where we were like, okay, we just need a space that fits all of these needs from design and can fit all of these tutorial objects and this hat rack and this food vending machine and all these ideas that are like expected of a hub out of the franchise. I think next game, I would very much hope that we settle on an answer earlier, but I'm super happy with how it turned out in this game. We had a very dedicated team, artists and designers and tech making that work, and it's easily our most interactable hub to date. I love the way that we can tell stories and briefings, like the way the car appears before the car mission, or the Phantom Metals and the Phantom Vault. And being able to have the time and space to do that was great. But it was painful putting the tutorial and the hub in the same place without a lot of concept planning there.
Managing scope is really important when working on games. How did you all work to manage the scope of I Expect You to Die 3 while working on it? And how much did the scope really change from the start to what you have now?
Good question. Big question, too. Short answer is with the help of a great team of producers and a project director who was always open to balancing the creative wishes of wacky designers like me who want to put everything in the game with our actual timeline. The longer answer is probably we know pretty well how long an I Expect You to Die level takes to make after the first game, 3 DLC levels, and then 6 levels in the second game. So our schedule was roughly the same as Phoenix, and we learned plenty of things on Phoenix, or I Expect You to Die 2, of how long it takes to port it, how long it takes to set it up for localization from our localization of the first game. And just being very certain about all of our understandings and learnings from these past 2 games made our scheduling solid. Managing scope in the day-to-day, it's hard. Everything is a decision. It's really hard to just let go at some point and call it good enough or call a feature done enough. But always being respectful, honest, and truthful, and compromising was a very healthy way to do that on our team.
Earlier, you mentioned that adding in the robots in the first level, the robots weren't initially planned to be part of a larger story, and then that evolved. How did you all work on the overarching story for the game and then weaving that in with the levels? And how did that evolve throughout the process of creating the game?
When we were making I Expect You to Die 2, the overall goal of that project was to be like I Expect You to Die 1, but with a more cohesive story throughout. So that's how we got John Juniper in his scheme and tracing it from level to level. And we know we wanted to repeat that for I Expect You to Die 3. But for 2, we kind of had the narrative design role emerge during development. We never kind of set it in stone any point until like the very end of the project, where I think Marlena Abraham is credited. But from 3, we had Jared Mason as our narrative director from the very start. We as a studio are very careful to not do plot first and then game later. We want to have a nice mix of organic levels that have their own vision and gameplay mechanics and fantasies that are not controlled by a story. We want to weave them in together at the same time. So we really did just start the game with like, okay, we know our levels, we know the fantasies and action set pieces we want out of them. And at the same time, Jared was developing the villain, Prism, and trying to get all that character and what arc he wanted to tell and what emotions he wanted to tell. And then as we started production, we started weaving them together by saying, okay, this emotional beat makes sense in this level, so let's arrange the level order like this. Obviously, Volcano was last level, so let's put it there. And a lot of like individually going through these problem solving of what fits best where, kind of like a giant puzzle piece. I think this process was great because it let the team, not just the narrative design, have a ton of input on like the jokes or the emotional arcs and stuff like that. And that makes I expected I, having silly jokes like that in all of your levels. It was challenging to kind of like fit some of the beats sometimes, like the gondola level, Cold Shoulder. It was difficult fitting in a whole cutscene at the end of there that wasn't necessarily entirely planned. But as the needs of the story came about, it made sense to kind of make that end of the level more of a cinematic cutscene that it is. So it's a lot of give and take to answer the question.
I feel like throughout this game, we've met a lot more fully voiced and fleshed out characters than we have in previous games. Can you tell me a bit about what it was like to work with voice actors to really bring these characters to life and fit it all into the levels?
I can't speak much to it. It's narrative and audio did almost all of that work. From my designer role, I will do was like request the line and say, hey, I need 3 lines about this souvenir penny press machine. Can you make it happen? And a great team made it happen, right? All I can really say is I'm shocked at how good our audio and narrative team are in writing dialogue and getting good performances out of our actors. It's amazing what our games sound like.
Are you able to tell me a bit about the decision to have the handler actually in the field with us during Blind Spot? Because I feel like the handler sometimes tends to sit back instead of being in the field, and this is the first level where he's actually gone out with the agent.
Yeah, he's actually on the roof in Eavesdrop from the second game as well.
Oh, I did not
very minor,
that.
but he is there because he throws you the flashlight.
Oh, yes.
So in I Expected I Won, the 4th level, the Winter Lodge, I think it's in one of the dev commentaries, there was like a prototype where he was in a hole and you would throw things in the hole and he would throw things back out at you. And for whatever reason, that didn't work out. So I Expected I as a franchise has always been a little bit scared about interacting with characters because it's very hard to pay off that in VR. But for some reason, I'm pretty sure it was my annoying idea to do it in Blind Spot, to just bring the handler out in the field and have him be an active role because I wanted to interact with this van that was already in the hub. So I wanted to, have fun with it, have fun to the franchise's history. And it was really just me and the other members of that level team pushing for it and begging for the scope to make it happen and making a couple of cuts in the level as a compromise to make it happen. But really, I think just putting him in situations where he can express himself differently is really valuable to the franchise. And I don't know, it's very funny giving him the hot dog and hitting him with the grappling hook or re-rendering him, and just love getting those reactions. And Jared time is cheap for us because Jared's on the team, so he can voice act whatever we need. So that was another decision in it.
Which parts of I Expect You to Die 3 did you have to put the most time and effort into to get the game just the way you wanted it?
I spent many hours on that cutscene at the end of the ski level. That was so difficult to coordinate with the story parts of it, the art aspects of it. It's using technology. We use Unity, so it uses Unity's playables and timeline system that we've not really used before in the franchise to get right. So learning that, onboarding that, getting the right collaboration tools with that took a load of time. More broadly, motion comfort was another thing that I personally invested a ton of time into. We had to rethink a lot of our assumptions about how are we okay with players being sick, and to more of like, how do we give players tools to play the level, even if they're a little bit uncomfortable. That affected both the game and the studio more broadly. Those are probably the 2 biggest. I'm trying to think of some dumb small things. We changed the button layout on the car radio dashboard like easily 20 times. Like that thing went through so many iterations for like no real reason, just small things here and there.
Is there anything that you wish you knew before starting work on the game?
Oh, so many things. I think if I can change anything, I learned during production that Insomniac playtested the Spider-Man 1 story by like storyboarding out all the major story beats and then narrating them and then just showing them to playtesters. And I would love for future games in the franchise to do more testing early on of story beats. I think we're great. We had a great narrative team. Well, most of our early prototyping was for character and for personality and traits. And I would have loved a bit more overarching feedback before going into making this whole project, I think. That's a very fine line to cross, though.
The game is filled with a ton of fun, small little details all over the place. What are some of your favorite of the small little details that are in there that you don't really think many players notice, but you really like?
I made it a point of working on at least one fun thing, maybe every 2 weeks on a Friday. So, that's only 2 fun things a month. I did plenty of other fun things, and as did many other designers and tech things. Funniest interactions. I love taking the time to put things like the hot dog going in the fireworks launcher in the hub. Small things like that. That would just make sense. I love the detail of handles. An example from 2, there's a mini fridge in the van where if you pull the handle on the fridge door, the little handle on the fridge door rotates out like a real fridge door, then rotates back in as you pull it out. I just love doing minor fun details like that. Yeah, just making time to make the joy is the answer.
So once the player has completed the main story, they get some bonus puzzles in the form of the phantom medals in the lobby. Now, I'm assuming these bonus pieces of content are setting up some story stuff for the next game. While creating this bonus content, how did you work to find the balance between giving the players enough that they're able to have a small hint into what the next game is going to look like and get excited for it, but not so much that the people who are working on the next game are going to be stuck with X, Y, and Z story beats?
Good question. That is something we asked ourselves every time we made any decision that could impact the future of the XYZ franchise. A lot of decision making around Zor and their presence in the game was the same questions too. Let's see. For the Phantom, I think we wanted to try and hint at exploring new territory that we had never really done as a franchise before. We're vague enough to have a pretty fertile field for the next team to do whatever they want with it in the future. We try not to make decisions that will be very clear set-offs or payoffs, right? So we're not, clearly showing you the Chekhov's gun on the wall that will then have to be fired, but establishing more character, vibes, and tones that will then be paid off in the future. Didn't work on that, so I can't comment in particular, but mostly that.
Looking back now, is there anything that you wish you could have done differently before the launch of the game?
On my other screen, looking at a bug backlog right now, that's not going to make it in, but I'm really happy with how it went, and our team delivered a very polished, pretty unbuggy experience. I don't think I would change anything how we did it. It was good.
What do you feel is the biggest lesson that you've learned from working on I Expect You to Die 3?
Oh, man. For me personally, this was like one of my first major team leadership roles. So learning the collaboration skills and individual attention giving that come with leadership was really valuable to me. And working with different levels of, directors giving feedback above me, team giving feedback below me, executive team giving other feedback, trying to splice all this together and make a vision, hold a vision, present it to the team, get approval. All of that kind of learning was super valuable to me. Yeah, I'll stick with that.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and create their first game?
Just make stuff. Just make little things. Do game jams. Don't burn yourself out, though, and don't go too hard. But just make small, little, tiny things and then keep going on, building up and up and up. And then start making games with other people too.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Good question. Right now, we're in between projects at the studio. I can't speak much to that. I don't think I can talk about any of that, actually. But next for me, who knows?
Awesome. I was talking with people on the Discord server yesterday and got a couple of community questions from the Discord server. So from Agent Sprinkles on the Discord server, why did you decide to have the Bear Archer shoot lasers instead of the traditional arrows we've seen in previous games?
Because it's funny, mostly. We made it a point to put the Bear Archer because he's already been in the first 2 games, so might as well put him in the next game. We really wanted to subvert the expectation there again. We did it in the second game by making him shoot someone else, not you. So it's just funny that a laser come out when you're expecting an arrow.
And then from Agent, we have cigars in it. Is each agent assigned a specific handler, or is it just lucky that Agent Phoenix has gotten the same handler 3 times in a row?
Good question. I'm sure both Phoenix and the handler have worked with many other people in their time at the agency, but I don't think our handler and Phoenix are going to be separated in the future. We'll see, though.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Yeah, anytime.
And that was the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked today's episode and want to see more content like it, make sure to follow or subscribe. Also, if you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Also, if you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.